Hiya 13. So this lesson is sort of a video of me talking through a few things because obviously some of the content's quite tricky. So first of all, this is what you've covered in the last week. So we looked at this a little bit yesterday. We've looked at the hydrological cycle and how it influences water budgets and river systems. So it's all to do with river regimes, hydrographs, which we talked about yesterday. So you need to be able to understand how to read those different graphs and understand how they tell us different things about drainage basins and how the water cycle operates. What we're going on to today, and it will continue next week, is looking at the factors that influence the hydrological cycle. So we're going to look at deficits within the system, and basically what deficits mean, if you think about the overall hydrological cycle, is where the inputs are less than the outputs to the system. So there's less precipitation than there is evapotranspiration, and as a result, often the drainage basin will suffer from drought. So what we need to look at for this, this is going to take today's lesson for me to explain it, and basically you just need to watch and listen and maybe make notes. And then next week looking at some case studies and trying to kind of compare the different impacts that deficits in the hydrological cycle can have. So what we're going to learn today is to understand the causes but also the impacts of water deficits within the system. So what is drought? So this is something we did at GCSE in quite a lot of detail. And you all will know that drought means dry conditions, that basically drought means that there's not very much water available. So it can have massive implications for people, the economy, the environment. So sustainably, drought isn't great. So in terms of an actual definition, it's where there is a water deficit in a particular place over a period of time. But just like with most things, the stuff that you learn at GCSE is much more basic. So actually what we need to understand is that there are different types of drought and there's various severities of drought, which we probably know. You know, when we say that the UK's in drought, it doesn't mean that we're all dying of thirst. It's a different impact for us. Whereas when we say places in Africa, say Ethiopia, are in drought, that could mean that there are people dying literally because they haven't got enough to drink. So we know that there's differences in severity, but for the A level, you need to understand the definitions of the terms on this slide. So there's different types of drought. There's hydrological drought, there's agricultural drought, there's socio-economic drought, meteorological drought, and famine drought. And if we go on to this slide, this just defines them. So you may end up wanting to print this out. So meteorological drought, meteorological just means the weather really. And this is kind of the type of drought that we experience quite a lot. So it's defined by shortfalls in precipitation as a result of short-term variability within the longer-term average overall. Okay, so basically if we get slightly less rainfall in our summer, then we are said to be in meteorological drought. So decreased rainfall totals over a period of time would cause more and more places to be in meteorological drought. Agricultural drought is almost an exacerbated example of meteorological drought. So it's where the rainfall deficiency from the varying rainfall, so reduced rainfall or increased evapotranspiration, actually leads to a deficiency in soil moisture. So there's actually less rain going into the soil, so it's causing a longer term issue once it becomes agricultural. And that means if there's not enough soil moisture, then it has a knock-on impact on plant growth, biomass, and can cause problems for farmers. So sometimes in this country we have gone into agricultural drought in the southeast of England where the soil moisture is not enough to sustain good crop growth. But generally we suffer more from shorter term meteorological drought. Hydrological drought is where the water levels of the rivers actually start decreasing. So actually where you're measuring river regimes, like we learned last week, and you actually see a decline in the discharge in the rivers. So where there's continual reduced precipitation and higher evaporation, there'll be reduced storage in lakes, rivers, in some places there'll be more salinisation, so there'll be more salt water intrusion, which reduces the fresh water available in that cycle. So once a place becomes in hydrological drought, it becomes much more of an issue and it's much harder to reverse. So the Colorado River Basin, which we touched upon yesterday, is an example of a place that's in hydrological drought, because literally over a longer period of time, the meteorological droughts have turned into agricultural droughts, which over time have led to an actual decrease in the amount of water in the river. And then these two should probably go in the opposite way around, really, but socioeconomic drought is where there isn't enough water for crop irrigation, hydroelectric power, and that can have an impact on demand. So there's more demand than there is supply. And in some parts of the world, this can actually lead to conflict breaking out. So we're going to learn more about that in future lessons, but it can lead to prices of water going up. So businesses taking advantage, or it can lead to kind of companies going under because they can't afford water, they can't access water. So socioeconomic is getting quite severe. And then probably the most severe, because it involves actually loss of life due to water loss, is famine. So when you have a famine, it's where the lack of water has completely caused the crops to fail. There's food shortages, which leads to famine, which means there's not enough food for people to eat, and it has massive impact socially, environmentally and economically. And famine's happening in lots of different places, like Yemen, for example, Ethiopia, parts of northern Kenya, Mali. So places that are more likely to suffer famine are those that regularly suffer meteorological drought and agricultural, but over time climate change might have exacerbated that and made it a longer term thing, which has then in turn led to famine. So you do need to understand the different definitions of drought, and obviously you can pause this, write notes if you want to. This diagram just shows you that there's natural climate variability. Okay, we know that the weather isn't the same every day. We know that over periods of time the climate changes, and so meteorological drought happens fairly regularly. But as you can see on this kind of flow chart, it doesn't usually last very long. So we might be in meteorological drought for a couple of months in this country, but then we'll come to winter and we'll get lots of rain and it will replenish the areas that maybe have suffered a bit of drought. As you go further down, so into hydrological drought, the effects of that tend to last a lot longer because it's much harder to replenish a whole drainage basin that's lost a lot of water. So for example, the Colorado no longer enters the sea. That drainage basin is hydrologically really affected by a reduction in precipitation, an increase in evapotranspiration, tied in with humans taking loads and loads of water from it, means it's in hydrological drought, and it has been in hydrological drought since the late 1990s. And that then has huge economic, social and environmental impacts. Okay, if you look at Water Risk Atlas, it shows that 70% of the global population is affected by water risk, by either medium, high or extremely high risk. You can see on there's quite a pattern. So places in the Sahara, Northern Africa, the Sahara Desert, there's an extremely high risk. These places are already naturally very low in terms of precipitation because they lie 30 degrees north of the equator, so it links into the global atmospheric circulation and so on. But there are other places as well. So for example, South Africa is really high risk for water stress, and it can sometimes tie in with population and demand as well. You can see in the southeast of the UK that we're actually high risk as well. So many of the countries that are the highest risk are the poorer countries, but actually some of the more wealthy countries like the UK, USA and Australia are also seeing areas of high risk. So water stress is a huge thing. What are the reasons for this then? So we need to know what some of the reasons are. Well, one of the reasons is simply the fact that the temperature is changing, okay? And sorry, in this example, it's not temperature, it is precipitation. So the amount of water being received from the atmosphere to the ground. Okay, so that flux from the atmosphere to the ground is changing in distribution. So parts of the world, there's some parts of the world that are experiencing a reduction in the average amount of precipitation they receive, and there are other parts of the world that are receiving an increase. So if you look at the map, places that are receiving an increase are places like Japan and the Philippines, good examples, and places that are receiving a severe decrease in the amount of precipitation are places like Brazil and sub-Saharan Africa and the south of the UK. So one physical cause is the fact that there's simply less rain in some places and that distribution's changing, which obviously you can relate back to climate change. Another one is temperature. Okay, so you can see that the vast majority of places in the world are experiencing a warmer than average temperature. And if you've got a higher temperature, that leads to a higher rate of evapotranspiration. So more water is going from the land back into the atmosphere, and therefore leading to an increased risk of drought. The other factor that's really important is something called El Nino and La Nina, which we did at GCSE, and it's to do with the ocean currents in the Pacific Ocean. So one of the things that I want you to do following this is to, you're going to look up, sort of watch a little video about El Nino and La Nina, and I will talk to you about that in the next Google Meet. But this is affecting climates, particularly around the Pacific Ocean, particularly in Eastern Australia and Western parts of South America, so Peru and Chile, and it's totally changing their climate and causing drought in some places, and then extreme flooding as well in some. So El Nino and La Nina also are another physical cause of the problem. So what I would like you to do when you finish watching this is you're going to do a little bit of research about one or the other of these places, because all of these places are seeing deficits in their hydrological cycle. So there are some video links on the PowerPoint which you can sort of click on and look at and make notes. You may wish to share this, so you might want to go in groups of 3 and get one of the people to look at one and share ideas, but you do need to understand the different effects of drought in different places and the different causes. So it is important not just to look up one and think that you're done, because you do need a variety of different places. So drought in Brazil is really interesting because obviously Brazil is in the intertropical convergence zone. So usually it receives a huge amount of rainfall. There's a big flux of water usually from the atmosphere to the land in the intertropical, the ITCZ. But that flux is changing, and so that's having an impact in Brazil. And we're actually seeing forest fires in the Amazon and so on. Sao Paulo is a huge city in South America, in Brazil, and there's some really good information about how the population there are really struggling to access clean, fresh water. So that's quite good, linking to Brazil. The River Colorado is superb because it's one of the rivers in the world which has been so disrupted by deficits, so people extracting water, less water inputting into the system, more water outputting, climate change, that this river doesn't actually now reach the sea. So it's really in a serious situation. The next thing is you can see here that there are lots of kind of human activities going on, so it's in a really, really heavily populated part of the world, and they're also polluting the water as well as speeding up the process of evaporation. Also kind of feeding agriculture, so livestock feeding requires a lot of irrigation, so they're sucking out loads and loads of water from the Colorado. The Sahel region of Africa is an area that we looked at GCSE, so there's a really good clip here to show the intensity of famine, drought in the Sahel, and there's some information there as well. Another thing to mention is that in the Amazon, this causes a positive feedback loop, okay? So you could start this wherever, but basically there's a temperature rise in the Amazon, which is causing more drought and wildfires. That's causing more trees to die, which is causing an output of carbon dioxide, which is leading to the temperatures rising. So the chopping down of the trees and the dying of the trees and the decomposition of the trees is releasing CO2 into the atmosphere, which is leading to the temperature rise, okay? It also, if you've got fewer trees, means that there's going to be less water intercepted entering the atmosphere. So there's less evapotranspiration, which means rainfall decreases, which means that it's drier. That tied in with the temperature rise means that that cycle gets even more intense. And that's what we call a positive feedback loop. Okay, there is an additional case study because this is so interesting. I wish I was teaching you this properly, but Cape Town in South Africa has had a real issue with this in the last couple of years in terms of its reservoirs drying out, and it's gone into hydrological drought and the impact that might have on the people. So what I want you to do, and this isn't going to be just this lesson, you're going to have next week's lesson as well, but I want you to sort of do some research on the case studies and look at the following things. So I want you to look at the causality, so what is causing the drought conditions or the deficit conditions in that particular place. How are the systems being affected? So really think about the system of inputs, outputs, processes, stores. So which processes are being interrupted? Is it interception? Is it infiltration? Is there more evapotranspiration? You know, what is going on? Any feedback loops. So how is that kind of deficit then having an impact on climate and a knock-on impact somewhere else? And the resilience also of the places involved. So how resilient are they? That means, so obviously poorer places, so places in the Sahel region are going to have a much lower resilience threshold than places, say the USA, where there's money and funding. So think about those 4 elements, and ideally you would print out a couple of these and sort of using notes and research, fill them in. So you've got some revision cards. And then if you want to, there's a couple of exam questions to have a go at. But again, this will be set next week as well. So I'm not expecting you to do all of this in this one lesson. Okay. I hope that all made sense. It's really tricky doing this without you in front of me.